Good morning, folks. I think we've got about 5 attendees at this Tech Talk webinar. This is on PCCE Software Preparation. My name is Bruce Wilkinson, and I'll be conducting this webinar. I just noticed I've even spelt my own name incorrectly there, but never mind. We can only go up from here. This comes from the newly crafted CCEI, the implementation class, and is an extract from one of those sections. In this section, we're going to look at the system requirements that are required for this software preparation. There's some initial pre-planning, in other words, some Active Directory considerations we need to look at, and also look at the CCE Software Installation overview. We do have an hour registered or an hour reserved for this particular Tech Talk, but I don't think we'll go anywhere near that. It's not that big of a topic, at least to the depth which we are going to go. So hopefully it'll give you some useful information, but I would expect that unless there is some discussion and stuff like that, it won't go for the full hour. In fact, we'll probably go for, I guess, around 30 minutes or so. I should quickly do a sound check before we go much further. I probably should have done that beforehand, but Chris or Joseph, Kari, Rudy or Scott, can you guys all hear me? Just want to sort of give me a shout or maybe put a message in chat to that effect.
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, so let's then move through and talk about the software installation processes. What we're going to identify those key software requirements that are necessary to facilitate the installation. We'll look, as I say, at the role of Active Directory, identify the aspects of the software installation process as opposed to configuration, and we'll make that point fairly clear, I think, when we get to that area. The PCCE deployment model, I guess, that we're looking at, and it is packaged rather than unified. Packaged, as you may be aware, has related to it a side A and side B UCS server, which contains CCE roggers, side A and side B, some peripheral gateways, admin workstations. It has 2 Finesse servers, Finesse 1 and Finesse 2 on side A and side B, respectively. CVP reporting server and CVP call servers. And of course, there is a call manager cluster, a publisher and 2 subscribers. So that essentially is the deployment that we'll be dealing with as we go through in this and in subsequent Tech Talks, which are also related to the implementation class. So you're getting a little bit of a snapshot, if you will, of that class. I've just realized my pen is not working here, so give me, say, 2 minutes and I'll get that up and running. Just excuse me very, very quickly. Okay, so I'm back again. Apologies for that. Something was wrong with this pen. So yeah, as I said, this is the deployment model that is, the basis of, I guess, of this discussion and other discussions in our CCE implementation class, and as a result, also this particular Tech Talk. Firstly, some general considerations, I guess, sorts of things that you're going to need to address before you start deploying your PCCE. Firstly, there is all of the Cisco documentation. And sadly, perhaps, because it's not exactly light reading, there's no way of avoiding it. We just need to be able to familiarize ourselves with the SRND, the planning guide, the staging guide, I think is probably, as important as anything else, because it's sort of like I used to paint houses for my father-in-law, and he always used to tell me that it's not the painting, it's the preparation that makes the job easier or more successful, and it's the same here. Unless you've gone through the staging guide, your equipment and all those sorts of things are as they should be, you're going to get difficulties further down the track. There is an installation and an upgrade guide, and depending where you're at in terms of coming from an existing platform, you'll need those, plus an admin and config guide. Now, you might think that everything you needed for the installation was current in the installation guide. That's not true. You do need some admin and config guide material as well. You'll need to address the certificate consideration fairly closely. In some instances, those certificates will be self-signed. In other, they'll be certificate authority certificates. We have, as part of this Tech Talk series, I think it's tomorrow, a session on adding a new site to that deployment we saw just previously. And in that particular Tech Talk, we do introduce certificates. There's yet another, not part of this Tech Talk, but maybe an upcoming one, certificate, or a detailed certificate discussion, if you will, because unless you're a security person, certificates are a real pain in the neck, but it's something that we have to sadly go through. And Active Directory still playing an important role in our implementation. One thing to note, and I'll probably mention it a couple of times down the track, there is a decoupling now between CCE install procedures and the Active Directory service account. It used to be when you were deploying unified CCE, I think in up to versions 11, that CCE could write service accounts to Active Directory. That's no longer true in 12.5, and those service accounts now need to be added in advance manually. So our goal here is to install the software, but interestingly enough, or importantly enough, configure nothing. So we really want to, I guess, get the message that there's a definite sort of difference between install and configuration. Install is what we're going to need to do, but then to configure the software and the hardware servers that those efforts have completed, we do need then to go to the wizard. The wizard does all the work for you, and that's again the subject of the next Tech Talk session. We don't talk a lot about licensing files in this session or in our class, but just be aware that you get a trial period of 90 days before you need licenses, and smart licensing is the way in which this stuff is managed, if you like. So then what's the overview of our implementation steps? Well, firstly, as we've said, we need to be considering the Active Directory configuration and any networking considerations first. Essentially, it's part of that staging activity that is needed. We then go and install, as opposed to install and configure, the CCE software, and that will be on all of these CCE components: ICM, CVP, Finesse, CUIC, Live Data, and Call Manager. Now, even though in this environment, in 12.5 environment, we have a wizard, even if you think back, if you've had some experience with earlier installations, early deployments of CCE, there was still a difference between the software installation and the configuration. You created the software which gave you the sort of web setup tools to set up your routers and loggers and things like that. I guess the only difference now, it's a big difference, but the difference is that configuration task has now been taken over by the wizard, as we've said. You will need to look at your security certificate management. All of those routers, loggers, all of the devices in the deployment need to be able to communicate with one another, and they are all communicating in a secure manner. And what that means, I guess, is that you have to go through and deploy certificates in each of those areas. The PCCE integration wizard will be run or managed from the SPOG, the single pane of glass. And then you'll need, however, to configure separately some devices. Not all, the wizard does not handle all devices, but we're going to come back to the SPOG and configure some additional services, mainly to do with CVP, the voice portal, virtual voice browsers, Finesse, COAC, and live data. By the way, interrupt at any time with any questions. I guess one of the things we assume here is that you guys are sort of fairly familiar with the basics of CCE, and there's no need for us to be expanding acronyms and things like that. But if that's not the case, then, you know, absolutely sort of please jump in and let us know. Part of what the wizard uses is a PCCE, there's another typo, another PCCE inventory file. And this is really like an answer file, such that when the wizard runs, it looks to this inventory file for details of how I should configure a particular device, a logger, if you're doing that, AW, COIC, etc. It will provide things like the IP addresses, the side A or side B that's being assigned for that particular, you know, host, and other things like services that are assigned to that device. Now, on Friday, tomorrow, we have a tech talk on the deployment wizard, and we'll talk more about that inventory file and dissect that at that time. But the wizard needs to match the deployment type. For instance, you may be deploying a lab-only simplex environment, for instance. If that's the case, then this inventory file should reflect that. One of the things that is also important before we sort of start doing any of the configuration or running the wizard is, of course, to make sure that the hardware we're providing is accurate and in accordance with the deployment. And again, these details are present in the installation guides from you know, the Cisco database, if you will, sorry, the Cisco documentation. And this is really just an extract, I think, of the more, well, they're all important, but the more, I guess, obviously important details. For instance, when we're talking, and this is all on our virtual machines, of course, everything is virtualized in PCCE these days. So we're talking now about, you know, VMs, but nonetheless, they're still going to have certain parameters, you know, associated with the VM OVA and things of that nature. But our roggers need a hard drive, 140 gig for the logger database. The AWHDS has a normal database. This is back like forever, a 1400 byte data and 100 log database. ICM and CVP servers have some IIS install requirements that are going to be followed. Look to the PCCE install guide for details on that. Getting sort of a little bit Active Directory related, the domain needs a service account, but for both the logger, the AW and SQL. The wizard will install the CVP servers, but you may, if you're coming from an earlier version, be familiar with the CVP OAMP server. That's gone away in 12.5. We do not manage anything from an OAMP now in packaged, but rather from the SPOG. When we install the ICM software, we don't do anything else. We don't run web setup. We don't join an instance. All of that is going to be created and completed by the wizard. We do, however, need to define the instance, but that's it. We don't sort of go ahead and run the web setup. Because this is packaged and because the wizard assumes certain things, we don't get any flexibility in terms of naming our NICs in either the ICM or the CVP server. For instance, UCCE private or UCCE public is the name of the ICM NICs that are necessary and would be part of, if you like, the that inventory file. But because you've got access to the inventory file, it's sometimes tempting to say, well, I should be able to change that name. Well, yes, you could, but the wizard wouldn't like it, okay? Similarly, the primary AW, side A, DAW, is its name and shall always be its name. Other things like the IIS services need to be augmented with several additional services to get the PCC installed. Again, look at the install guide for further details on that. The loggers need the 200 gig HDD, as we've said. There are 3 call manager servers. So, you know, 1 being the publisher, 2 being subscriber. We'd need to set up the Axel user account with Axel permissions. PCCE install will do all the JTAPI configurations that we require. Recall, if you will, when you may have installed an earlier UCCE version, you had to create the username password for JTAPI on the PG as well as in the call manager. All that is sort of done by the wizard. So it takes a little bit of time, I guess, to really come to grips with exactly what is has been taken over by the wizard and what we still have to do. But again, going through the guidelines in the install guide is sort of where you get most of that detail. There's quite a bit of Active Directory, or quite a few Active Directory considerations to go through. And full disclosure, I'm not an Active Directory expert by any means. Probably know enough just to get myself in, you know, some sort of trouble. But nonetheless, let's sort of talk about what is necessary for Active Directory. And again, I refer you to the staging guide, if you like, for more detail on that. One of the, I think, most relevant things, I guess, say again, that the decoupling of what was historically a CCE Active Directory interoperation, if you will, where you could write CCE to write objects from CCE into Active Directory. But that's no longer the case, and CCE basically becomes read-only in regard to Active Directory and no longer has permissions to create any service accounts or supervisors, by example. Active Directory as normal, of course, is still, you know, the central repository for managing network resources and things of that nature. ICM software uses Active Directory services to control user access rights, perform setups, configuration, reporting tasks, and things like that. You know, for example, it would grant permission for the distributor to read the logger database. It supports Windows Active Directory domains in native mode, and user ICM user information is stored in the Active Directory OU. So some of that is, you know, as per normal. Some of that is, you know, a little bit new given 12.5. Let me see if there's anything I've missed at this point. Well, I guess you can read this slide as well as I. You know, we are supporting single multi-domain, single Active Directory forest topology. We do need global catalogs. Read-only domain controllers are no longer supported. Active Directory uses the MSQL, SQL database management, maintenance, and synchronization is going to be controlled by the database processes. But again, you can read that, you know, as well as I. Again, some more ICM configurations. Authenticated users need credentials of the domain account. Active Directory tools or Domain Manager are the only supported tools for provisioning Active Directory. You might be familiar, if you will, with Domain Manager. That's been around for a long while. It's still about in version 12 and is still a supported tool for provisioning in Active Directory. You can't create ICM servers in the ICM OU hierarchy. You can only apply the ICM group policy template to those OUs that contain the ICM servers. The other thing to note, I guess, is that single label DNS domain names, like for instance ICM, are not supported. Multi-part, as that says, names ICM.org, ICM.net, etc. are acceptable names. And again, there's more information on configuring domains and single label DNS names in the Windows documentation, because that's really sort of part of that service. Domain Manager looks, you know, much the same here in 12.5 as it always has. You need to be using Active Directory staging tools to create your OU security objects. Domain Manager will include or allow you, of course, to create for your instance certain, you know, log-on security features, etc. I guess there are two types, I suppose, of organizational units that, you know, we should mention. There are the application created OUs, and our installation creates several of these OU objects, containers, users, groups, etc. For the solution. You need some delegated control over the OU in Active Directory to install those objects. All of the created groups in this application created OU are domain local security groups, and all user accounts are domain accounts. There is also the administrator created OUs. Obviously, by the name perhaps, an administrator can create certain Active Directory OUs, and a best example of that is an OU container for unified CCE servers. That's manually added, and it contains the VMs that are members of that domain. You move those VMs, those virtual machines, into that organizational unit once they are joined to the domain. So there's a little bit of, you know, toing and froing to be done in our Active Directory, and if you come from an Active Directory background, then none of that will be sort of mysterious to you. If you don't, then it does require a bit of study and a bit of service or some help in order to get that right. But again, all this is part of the staging and is sort of a pretty important part of the environment, I would think. Again, looking at Domain Manager, we've installed our instance facility, our root, our facility, and our instance. And the instance is then going to create certain groupings, and the role of each of those groupings is as listed, say, in this slide, in that the configuration security group enables the user, who is a member of that group, to access configuration manager, script editor, the internet script editor as well. The setup security group does just that. Ability to start and stop services through service control, gives you sufficient rights to set up tools like web setup, installation tasks, etc. And then the service security group is really a read-only group used by the machines, if you will, the logger and the distributor, etc., to be able to access other machines in the service and databases and things of that, like the logger database and things of that nature. What to be said here? What are we trying to say on this slide? Again, I guess prior to release 12, as we've said, Active Directory security groups could have been controlled by CCE. In this brave new world, that's not the case. Active Directory, still, however, manages those user privileges that are associated with the security groups. By default, now package CCE decouples that authentication and authorization function. The good news about that might seem to be a sort of a step back just for the purposes of security, if you will. But the good news of that is that it removes the need to use Active Directory to manage authorization in packaged components. What it does mean, though, is that the CCE solution needs now to have us add user IDs to the local user groups on each local machine for authorization. Those privileges are going to be provided by memberships to local user groups in the local user machine. An Active Directory then is only used for authentication. So the decoupling, has now taken the authorization away. So in another way, regardless of, what your UCCE staging is doing, once you've gone through that staging guide, all of the core tools like Domain Manager only now need read-only access to Active Directory. We don't write to Active Directory anymore. No more Active Directory security groups, as a result, of that change, if you will. In terms of the CCE software installation, having gone through all the Active Directory pain, if you will, we then need to move on to our servers themselves. And for each of those servers, there are some details, if you will, for both our ICM servers, CVP, Call Manager Cluster, and Finesse, CUIC, Live Data servers as well. A couple of things to point out here. I think we've already mentioned the logger and or Rogger database procedures or the hard drive facilities for that. All runs on Windows 2016 using SQL 2017 now. No longer any generic PGs, but there is support for 3 PGs per server. So we have one box still, but on that there is a specific Call Manager server, Call Manager PG, a Media Routing PG, and a VRU PG. The Media Routing PG, of course, is going to be used should you choose to implement outbound option or enterprise chat and email. In the sort of standard, voice deployment, ECE has no, the media routing PG has no role. And we need a 750 gig hard drive for the DAW. CVP servers, also Windows 2016, again, no OAMP for PCCE. The reporting server is required in a production environment, but for a lab environment, which sort of what our classes are run on, that's an optional facility. Just as an aside, I suppose, even if you didn't want to report on anything to do with the CVP virtual voice browser interface, but you wanted to use courtesy callback, the reporting server would be a required server. Reason is the reporting server uses courtesy callback for its storage of the callback number and things of that nature. In terms of the call manager cluster, we do need to activate Axel and the CTI manager services. The Axel account creates JTAPI account in the cluster via the wizard. Okay, so it's the wizard that sort of activates that, but it's Axel that actually does the writing in the call manager cluster. And of course, Finesse, CIC, and live data servers, again, installed, but only configured in those cluster settings. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to talk about here. Those OVA files, I might have breezed over that, but they're of course available on CCO from Cisco. So that's where you go to get those. We talked about ICM, CVP. The VOS, server requirements, like CIC, VVB, etc. Again, they are standard VOS install procedures, but more details on that, I guess, again, in the documentation. ICM SQL considerations. Again, no big deal. SQL is installed on the loggers and the DAWs. Ensure collation and sort order is appropriate. In other words, the Latin one, collation design and binary sort order, that's the same as it always has been. And you'll need to do the protocol bindings post install, if you will. So that's not a whole lot different from what you and I are probably used to for SQL. For our CCE, ICM CCE software, we install the CCM software on all of the ICM CCE servers. So we've got our ROGers, we've got our PGs, etc. But very, very importantly, we do not run or attempt to run the web PG setup after that installation, but that's going to be performed by the wizard. So the simple goal, then is just to get the ICM software installed on all of those servers, but then do nothing. The PCCE integration wizard is going to perform those typical configuration and post-configuration steps for us. Folks do talk about package having, you might have heard the term, the golden template, which has a, at least when it was introduced, gave you sort of the impression that you just put this in a slot somewhere and walk away and have a coffee and come back and you've got yourself a PCCE packaged environment. That's not quite true. It's not quite that automated. The wizard still does a splendid job, but there's still a lot of stuff that we need to do for that. We run domain manager, but domain manager only. So this is again something that you're going to do prior to the wizard, and domain manager is going to add the root, the facility, and the instance as required. Again, illustrating no web setup. Domain managers included in the CCE tools program group, part of what you've created when you installed that particular software. And domain manager is the utility that, again, as we said, we're going to use to create the instance, the facility, and the root, sort of moving up in the Active Directory where PCCE is going to live. So not a whole lot of difference in installing that software. For CCE, the software installation looks very similar. Notice, however, that there's no OAMP, no Ops Console. That's all now done in the SPOG. The inclusion when you're building that, includes the call server, the VXML server, and the media server. In that, with that environment. Notice also there's some additions to the encoding format of our voice prompts. ALAW and MULAW, it's always been there. I think G729 is the new addition for this particular service. But again, no OAMP for PCCE. And then lastly, we've got another CVP slide, sorry. And there's some important points on it. I can't believe I left them out. There is the CVP server installation wizard that you'll just hit the button and boom, that software is installed. But again, it's just the software. There's going to be configuration and integration and all those sorts of good things done by the wizard. It calls for the fully qualified domain name for the X509 common name, which is something that's a little bit different to what we might have been used to on earlier versions. And you'll install also via this one DVD the reporting server. Note that the reporting server needs to be installed before that machine joins the domain. Okay, try and do that in reverse order. I think something will complain. And again, that's not new. That's always been the case, that we should add that reporting server prior to joining domain. Local users and passwords, definitions, etc., are in the wizard. And again, the reporting server, if you're building a lab deployment, you'll find that the reporting server is not mandatory, but is mandatory for a production mode. Even if you don't install it during this period, you can go back to the SPOG and build it after that wizard has been completed. And then for things like COAC, live data, finesse, the identity service and call manager, the VOS install procedures are pretty much as they've always been. There's not a whole lot of difference in those deployments. But again, the wizard isn't doing this configuration. It's part of what we need to do in our service. Okay, so as I thought, we wouldn't take up quite the whole hour for this. Any questions or discussions or anything on this software installation? If I could just sort of maybe summarize all of that. And I guess to some extent, this is a personal reflection based on where I'm coming from. The hardest part and the bits that you do need really to concentrate on, I think, for me anyway, is in the staging. That preparation, and that includes, the VM OVA specification, as well as Active Directory and your associated sort of domain associations. You get that right, you spend some time on those sorts of areas. Then when you come to actually do the software installation, that, well, I'm not going to say it falls out, but that's sort of much simpler. You might be thinking of your questions. While you're doing that, let me just say that by virtue of your attendance at this course, you can use TT20 for 20% off our new Cisco CCE courses, which include CCEF, the Foundations class, the Administration class, the Advanced Administration class, and the Reporting class. It's a bit of an irony, and this is, I know this session is being recorded, but let me say it anyway. It's a bit of an irony that these Tech Talks are coming from our CCE installation class, and that's not included, at least on this slide, in this grouping of courses. I don't know why that is. It's sort of beyond my pay grade, but if you got with your account manager, you know, maybe you could do something. Don't tell anybody I said that. So let me go back, you know, once again to questions, invite questions, discussions. If there aren't any, let me thank you for attending this Tech Talk. There is another Tech Talk that's coming up in 10 minutes, which is going to talk, I believe, let me see, about that integration wizard that we'd been speaking, you know, of through this class. So it sort of flows on fairly well from this particular Tech Talk. Many of you guys might be sort of moving on straight from that, but even though we've got that 10 minutes to spare, I don't want to move into that until the advertised start time, just in case we've got some new folks coming to the integration wizard. By the way, if you are coming back to the next Tech Talk and, you know, you've got some software prep questions that you might have, then feel free to sort of fire them at me at any point. My covenant with you when you ask those questions is that if I can't answer them, I'll let you know that. And that's more likely than not, or as likely as not, because can be a very complex area. But I'll endeavour to find out for you. I won't sort of try and waffle past anything. So if there are no questions, let me thank you.